Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in today for our Amplify North Dakota, our 2025 North Dakota Legislative Recap event. My name is Amy Jacobson, and I'm the Executive Director of Prairie Action North Dakota Institute. And I wanted to welcome you for joining us today in this somewhat new format. We opted to pre-record this month's session so that we could give ample time to a number of advocates and partners of ours that worked alongside Prairie Action and all of you out there to do incredible work that upholds our values at the legislature. And so we needed just a little bit more time. We also know that these precious early summer months are, we have limited time, and we want to be cognitive of that for you, the viewer. So this will be presented in a format in which you can sit down, grab yourself a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, and watch when you have the time available to do so. So thank you. Thank you for making that time. Amplify North Dakota is one of our flagship programs at Prairie Action. It's designed to give people the tools and the platforms to dive deeper into the issues that shape their daily lives, from education and healthcare to housing and human rights and democracy. This event is a reflection of our shared commitment to economic and social justice and is a testament to the resilience and the resolve of communities all across North Dakota. The 2025 legislative session really tested our values. It strained our institutions, and it revealed once again the urgent need for sustained strategic organizing. And that's what we're hoping to provide to you through our work at Prairie Action. So today, I want to give you just a highlight reel of some of the things that we, the collective we, face, what we, the collective we, fought for, and what lies ahead. So I'm going to start today to talk a little bit about democracy. It's really it's our foundation as a country and as a state. And one of the most troublesome themes of this legislative session was really a coordinated attack on the powers reserved to the people. This is powers reserved to the people is specifically defined within the North Dakota State Constitution. It protects the citizen-initiated ballot measure process. And that process allows the people of North Dakota, to bring forth important policy changes to improve our lives and our communities. And it is a tool that we use when we have a legislature that is not effectively solving those issues or bringing forth the resolution to the things that we need. And so in particular, there were two bills that were passed that all of you need to be very aware of. They were both passed out of the legislature and will go in front of the voters in 2026 to be enacted into law. So we do have an opportunity to defeat these measures that are attempting to limit our access to the initiated ballot process. So first, we will see in June of 2026, a measure that would impose a single subject on ballot measures. And while that might sound good, here's the catch. The bill, and it was 4007, gives one elected official, the Secretary of State, unilateral power to define what qualifies as a single subject. You know, that gets pretty tricky. And when something is undefined and it's unchecked, it's really ripe for politicalization. And so we really need to be careful about that. This is not something that North Dakotans want. Sometimes policies can be complicated and they may appear as if they have multiple issues, but really it's a solution that has multiple stems in order to get to that policy solution. And so it's something that we need to be really paying attention to, and there will be more coming out against that. But again, it's really important to know single subjects not defined within the law is left up to a single elected individual to define, and that's really ripe for misuse in the future. Secondly, on the November ballot in 2026, we'll see what was bill number 3003, which would now require a 60% supermajority vote for a constitutional ballot measure to be passed into law. So in plain terms, when we have a policy that's supported by a majority of people, that won't be enough. We'll have to have a supermajority of 60% of the voters cast in favor of a measure in order for it to be enacted into law. This is not democracy. It is obstruction, and it is something that we all need to be paying very close attention to as we move into the next year. And while the legislature pushed these anti-democracy policies, they also overturned the will of local voters, striking down Fargo's approval voting system and removing that tool as expanded voter choice for all communities in North Dakota by banning its usage. We have a lot of things to examine and to continue to fight for when it comes to the democracy in North Dakota. So please stay connected and stay tuned as we move into the next year. Now let's talk a little bit about social justice. We know that's another pillar of our work. And it was deep. There were some deeply harmful attacks on marginalized communities this session. We saw really a flood of culture war bills. These bills weren't about protecting families. They were about controlling them. They were about fear, not about freedom. But here's what gives me hope. North Dakotans, we pushed back. And because of all of your advocacy and the advocacy of our panelists we'll talk to today, and of the work of some really strong champions at the legislature, a lot of the worst proposals did not pass this year. There was no 10 Commandment forced display of the 10 Commandments in our classrooms. There was no criminalization of our librarians, which was very close to happening. There were no bans on IVF, no bans on abortion, and no dangerous so-called conversion therapy. Those things were all successfully thwarted because of the work that we did together. And among these very many challenges, there were also important victories within the social justice realm, especially for the Native American community, whose legislative leadership and the organizations like North Dakota Native Vote championed some important pieces of legislation that were successful and passed, including allocating funds to the State Historical Society for Native American grave protection and other projects. So this passed unanimously, and it provided essential resources to return human remains and sacred artifacts to the tribes. Now let's turn from our social justice to our economic justice leg of our work. There was a real fight there for opportunity, for stability for families, and for dignity in people's lives. We started this session with a very clear and achievable goal. A wise, big coalition of individuals and organizations, actually over 100 organizations, came together and said, we want universal school meals for our kids in North Dakota. Nearly 80% of North Dakotans supported it, and the data was clear. Families would have a direct savings from this bill of $850 per year per student a parent would have back in their pocketbook. And we know that people could really use those funds right about now. But the legislature refused to act. And instead of ensuring that every child gets the food that they need to learn and grow, they offered a modest bump in eligibility limits for free and reduced lunch. So while that was a compromise, and we're glad that it happened, we're glad that more kids are being fed, but we're really disappointed that too many kids were left behind. School meals is an important part, will be an important part of the conversation going forward in North Dakota. And when it came to housing, there was we have a real crisis in North Dakota, a growing crisis in North Dakota. And advocates pushed for a very significant investment to address the homelessness and housing insecurity statewide. Instead, what we got was a drastically reduced funding package, one that really leaves a lot of challenges to lie ahead of us. At a time when communities are facing record housing pressures, this was actually very disappointing. And to make matters worse, the governor had a botched veto in a very key provision of the housing segment, which has left lawmakers scrambling. There was a procedural error. It was a procedural error so significant that it may require a special session to fix, likely needs a special session to fix this error, and one that is critical to ensure that funds flow to the homeless and the housing programs without interruption. People's lives and health and lives are at stake. So I am going to encourage you to continue to read and take in the information on journalism from the North Dakota Monitor. They've done an excellent job of covering the situation and will keep us all apprised as to what the next steps will be and how this situation will be fixed, and hopefully very quickly. So yet through all of these sorts of things, people kept showing up. Advocates, organizers, and everyday citizens were making their voices heard in the committee rooms, by submitting testimonies, sending emails, making phone calls, showing up at community events where they're able to talk with their legislators. And that made a difference and will continue to make a difference. So these challenges that we just talked about do underscore what we need to do and why we need to do more. So Amplify North Dakota, it matters. And Prairie Action, this is why we exist. Our mission is rooted in community, building a just, inclusive, and equitable state where everyone can thrive. And we don't do this work alone, and we never have. And that is why I am very proud to introduce to you our panel of leaders who you'll hear from today. These are partners who we worked with shoulder to shoulder, both at the Capitol and in the classrooms, in the courtrooms, and in the communities across the state. They're valuable voices who work in coordination with so many different folks, but we're really excited to have them here today. Some of them you've heard from in our previous Amplify and some not. So I'm going to introduce you to those panelists. We will be hearing from today Mariah Ralston, who champions the right to read and combating censorship in our school and in our libraries. Chandler Esslinger, who's been working tirelessly with the FM Coalition to end homelessness. Cody Schuler, defending civil liberties with the North Dakota ACLU chapter. Erin Oban, who's been advocating for strong public schools through the North Dakotans for Public Schools, and Christina Sambor, who leads efforts to protect children and to really advocate for reproductive and human rights. Their work reminds us that this movement is made of people, real people, you, me, and everyone in this Zoom room today. We are the ones that make a difference. So thank you for being here. Now let's go ahead and turn it over to our interviews. All right. Well, Mariah, thank you so much for joining us today at Amplify North Dakota. We're so excited to be talking with so many of the great advocates who worked really hard this past legislative session on some really important bills. And of course, you are one of those people. So if you could take a few minutes, could you introduce yourself and a little bit about the organizations which you were working with this legislative session?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy, for organizing this, and I'm just happy to be here. So I'm the co-chair of Right to Read North Dakota, which we launched in December of 2024. And we are a nonpartisan group of parents, librarians, citizens dedicated to defending North Dakota's right to access information. And yeah, we had a very exciting session with our library bill that just refused to quit. But luckily,
well, let's dig into that. So I think the big bill that you guys were fighting this year was called Senate Bill 2307. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Do you want to remind us all a little bit about that bill and the impacts that it would have had on libraries and communities?
Sure. So SB 2307 is a bill that would have altered obscenity code to remove the exemption for libraries and schools. We have that exemption because we're using materials for educational purposes. And this is a strategy that's been being used all over the US. And it was also tried to pass in 2023, and it came back again this session. It was kind of depicted as closing a loophole that was allowing pornographic materials in libraries, which is untrue. There is no obscene materials in libraries. But what it would have done would have been open up libraries and schools to potential litigation and liabilities.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like what would that have looked like?
It would have opened the gates to frivolous lawsuits, because whereas now people couldn't get very far if they said that, the bluest eye is obscene. Under that law, if they had won, the exemption would have been gone. And so that citizen could claim this is obscene. They could bring the library to court or the school to court. In the process of this bill, they said that would first go to the state's attorneys in each county if the patron wanted, who was making the challenge. And then the state's attorneys would have had to make their ruling whether these books were obscene, which would have resulted in them each having to read each of the books from start to finish, because the Miller Law, you have to consider a book in its entirety. You can't take one page and say this is obscene. It has to be in the context of the full work.
Okay. And so really what we're kind of looking at is that we already have laws, we already have protocols and processes in place to ensure that the material that is in the schools is not sexually explicit material, correct?
Correct.
But that this bill could have opened the door to allowing an individual's really independent belief about what is obscene to kind of trump what our current protocols are in place for libraries. And in some ways even but jeopardize or threaten librarians if the individual who felt like something was obscene was not removed from the shelves, even after going through a review process. That individual felt they weren't, but they still wanted it removed because they felt they were righteous. they would have additional steps that they could take legally
Yes.
to, to try to swipe that from our shelves. Is that like
Yes.
sound like a synopsis? That's kind of where I was during legislative session. It seemed like it
Nope, that's a good one.
was giving people a lot of power to usurp the very strong and important protocols and processes we already have in place to keep libraries safe for all people, right?
Right. And it would have opened the door for librarians to have possibly class C felonies levied against them. It was never made clear in the bill whether it would be a class B misdemeanor or a class C felony. It was scary.
Yeah, it does sound very scary. Well, Mariah, along with all of those reasons that we just talked about why this bill is really unnecessary, it was also going to be very expensive to taxpayers. Could you tell us a little bit about what the fiscal impact of this bill could have been had it not been vetoed?
Yes. So the fiscal note was attached in between crossover and when it was on the Senate side and the House side, and it only included the aspect of the bill that would have affected online databases and filtering in libraries. So actually, the bill would have cost a lot more because it didn't take into account libraries having to re-review their collections with staff time or state's attorney's time having to process these complaints, which there was no limit to how many complaints a person could levy. So the bill had a fiscal note of 2 million for the next two bienniums, one in each. So they would have had to pay to add additional filtering in each library that had computers because, well, the libraries already have computers to be in compliance with SIPA. Otherwise, they don't receive their funding to support that. But this would have been additional filtering that would have just been a kind of because those systems are like all or nothing. You can't really minutely filter, so it would have had to really cut out a lot of material that could have even potentially had things that were objectionable or sexually explicit, quote unquote.
So it was projected $2 million, and that was sort of like the bottom of the barrel when we really, if we would have had to implement the bill, North Dakota taxpayers would have been paying greatly. Yeah.
Yes, we believe so.
Oh, that's wild. The other question, as we move through, so obviously, I think to the people who tune into Amplify North Dakota and who followed this and spoke out on this bill, this is one of those bills they call it culture war bill, and it's one of those bills that takes up a lot of time and resources and also attention as we move through the legislative session. Sometimes that's, in my opinion, to divert from other matters at hand, and one of those things that really isn't solving any problems, but rather making things more difficult and diverting the resources from where we really need to put them. And I think your campaign was kind of cool in that you had so many different kinds of people stepping forward to say, no, this bill needs to be defeated. And I'd love for you to share with everybody a little bit about some of the actions or individuals that kind of stood up against this bill.
Yes. We had a really strong social media following. Citizens from all over North Dakota were really engaged and were very wanting to keep along with the process. Like, who do I send the email to now? Who do I contact now? Because it was very difficult and it was changing from week to week. But we had a movement of readouts happen in between crossover. And so Right to Read had offered kind of promotional materials and like a hub on our website, on our Facebook page. But otherwise, we had people in each of the cities that volunteered in North Dakota hold readouts outside their libraries in the cold.
Yeah.
They sat outside for half an hour and read. And we had it was patrons from those cities. It was librarians. In Williston, a lawmaker showed up and said, I agree this bill is really out there and really going to be bad news for North Dakota. And we had letters to the editor, really strong emailing campaigns. So we were just so thankful for the outpouring of activism that people engaged in for this.
And from an outside perspective, I'm sure that also kind of helped librarians feel a little better. I mean, when you're you don't go out to be a librarian to assume you're going to become under attack, potentially have criminal charges against you when a patron becomes upset. And so to see, from the outside, it looks so heartwarming to see, mothers and children and all kinds of people showing up to show we love our libraries. These are safe places for our families and our communities, and they provide a whole host of important resources for everybody in North Dakota. So I was really great to see
Yeah.
that. And I'm glad you had such great support that way. And perhaps those sorts of things, all the activities that you lined up and the campaign that you ran, I'm sure, are what led to the ultimately Governor Armstrong vetoing the bill. So what did you feel when you heard that he vetoed the bill?
Immense relief, first of all, and kind of disbelief. We were just kind of so geared up to, well, what happens if it doesn't go, if he, signs it? And I'd say there was a lot of emotions, because we were just all in such geared up mode for so long. But I'm just incredibly thankful to him. His remarks after the veto were rock solid. He's a First Amendment supporter, and that's just very great to hear for the next 4 years. So
That's right. That's right. We have
yeah.
them. And hopefully, that those words were strong enough to keep some of this at bay next legislative cycle. Did he happen to do the veto on like World Reading Day or something like that? I feel like there was some sort of day of
Oh,
notoriety in which it was. We'll have to look
I
into that.
missed it. Okay,
We'll
there
have to
was
look into that. There was some day that day. There was two of them. Anyway, I
cool.
digress. Well, before we move on, I just and close our interview, and I just would like for you to have the opportunity to tell people ways that they can continue to be engaged, whether through, Right to Read or through supporting their libraries, or what ways do you think that people should stay in tune and stay engaged?
Yes. Well, Right to Read will still be here. Please follow us on Facebook, subscribe to our website for updates. But in the next 2 years, please just continue to support your libraries, use your library card, attend programs, run for library boards or school boards if you have openings in your area or if you know people that would be interested. As Amy mentioned, this is a culture war, and frankly, we lost again. We were saved by a veto again. So we just have a lot of educating to do and helping people to understand this is not rooted in a real problem in North Dakota. This is coming from out of state. This is a national strategy. And Amy's also right. It's very demoralizing for librarians and for teachers. So please just support them as professionals that we know are doing their jobs to the best of their ability and to great results. Libraries our statistics are better than ever. People are using the libraries more than ever in North Dakota. One other thing I'll mention recently in the Devil's Lake School District, they voted to remove the absolutely true story of a part-time Indian from their 8th grade curriculum. So they went through the formal process. They had a book review committee, and no faulting them there, but it's just very sad to see that book removed. There's not really anything comparable for that age group to read. So we just have a lot, and I'm not exactly sure the reasoning why I didn't watch or I wasn't able to watch the video. But I do think we're going to be in a period of kind of self-censorship or like fear that if we don't give in, more bad things will happen. So please just support intellectual freedom in your schools and libraries.
Thank you, Mariah. That's a perfect way to close. I mean, I do think it's that fear factor, not just for in libraries, but across the board, and kind of the environment in which we're all living. So thank you for bringing that forward, and also reminding us that all of this stuff, we can really support our work really strongly locally, right? The local
Right.
library boards and the other ways that you can be involved to ensure that those outside interests that are often national and looking for places to have wins, that they don't get those in North Dakota because our local people
Yeah.
are stepping up and taking care of it themselves. So
Yes.
thank you for doing that, and thank you for
Yeah.
being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Amy. Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome, Chandler. Thank you for joining us for Amplify North Dakota. I know you've been a panelist during the legislative session, so we're excited to have you back to give us a little bit more info on what happened during the 2025 legislative session. So if you could you start with just an introduction of yourself and the organization in which you work?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Chandler Esslinger, and I am the executive director of the Fargo-Moorhead Coalition to End Homelessness. And I'm also the board chair for the North Dakota Coalition for Homeless People, which is kind of our big legislative advocacy lobbying body across the state.
Well, let's go ahead and jump right in. Why don't you tell us, as you were working towards a legislative session, what were you, as far as someone who works in housing and in North Dakota, what were you hopeful for?
Yeah, well, we feel really strongly, both at our local and statewide coalition, that we have a really huge opportunity to make huge strides on preventing and ending homelessness across the state. And so we spent the better part of the interim session working in partnership with the Government Services Committee on a housing and homelessness study. And we had two real objectives kind of going into that interim session, and the opportunity we had to educate folks about homelessness and the needs for housing across the state. And that was really helping folks understand that, number one, housing is the solution to homelessness, and that we have a incredibly diverse network of service providers across the state who successfully prevent and end homelessness every single day, and that they have been chronically underfunded for many, many years. And so if we want to see kind of these systematic and sustained reductions in homelessness over time, we need to make sure that those programs are well funded to support the people in our communities who need assistance, and that we have the housing available in our communities to ensure that everybody has a place to live. And so those were our two biggest goals kind of in that interim session. And that really culminated in a recommendation in this interim government services committee that developed into Senate Bill 2030. And Senate Bill 2030 had a number of different core components in it. Most notably was a recommendation to increase the funding for the North Dakota Homeless Grant from what had been $2.5 million in the previous biennium up to $10 million. And that really would have provided a lot of infrastructure and service support to agencies across the state. We also really wanted to help folks understand, again, just the chronic need for housing across the state. As we look at the next 5, 10, 15 years, we are going to be facing a housing deficit. And when we have a lack of housing, and especially a lack of affordable housing, that puts a lot of pressure on the homelessness response system. It means that more people who are in economically precarious situations and lose their housing are going to have a more difficult time gaining their housing. And then maybe people who are coming here, maybe for economic opportunity, maybe they're unsuccessful, are just going to have a harder time finding a place to live and maintaining that housing. And so ensuring that the state legislature was making a really strong investment and commitment into developing that housing, especially that affordable housing, was a really big priority as well. And that culminated in the recommendation for a $200 million investment in the Housing Incentive Fund. And that is a pocket of dollars that live in the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency, and it provides gap funding for housing developments across the state. In our rural communities, it can fund up to 50% of an overall housing project. And in our larger, more urban communities, it can fund about 30% of that gap financing. And so that really helps bring projects over the finish line, especially those affordable housing projects that are just end up being really expensive just because of how the nature of affordable housing. And so that was a really critical recommendation that came out of that. One of the other things that we know as a system is that the earlier we can identify young people and their families who are at risk of or experiencing homelessness, the better opportunity we have to intervene and support more sustainability longer term. And so we really wanted to see an increased investment in the homeless liaisons in the top 10 school districts across the state with the highest number of enrolled students experiencing homelessness. This we kind of consider to be a pilot project. So all school districts across the nation are required by the federal government to have homeless liaisons. And what we know is that a lot of times those schools have somebody designated for that position, but it's not their full-time job. And that just really limits people's ability to identify families and youth experiencing homelessness and support them as much as they may need. We do an incredible job. We are a very resourceful, very scrappy state, and we have lots of people who really care about those young people and their families. And if we could fund those positions better, we know we would just see better outcomes overall. And so that was another kind of big request that came out of that bill as well. And then we also wanted to encourage a $50,000 investment in a more comprehensive study about housing and homelessness across the state, really to help us chart a path towards how we can systematically reduce homelessness across the state, and just make some more key recommendations about the resources that are required to do that. So there were a couple things, other things that ended up in SB 2030. It came out of that Government Services Committee with an 11-to-1 recommendation, which was an incredible way to kind of start off the legislative session. And then from there, as you mentioned, kind of initially, things got a little crazy, and we saw pieces of that bill kind of get dismantled, put into other bills, especially the Industrial Commission bill, which is SB 2014, because that's the agency, the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency falls under the Industrial Commission bill. So we saw a piece of that bill actually go away. the bill SB 2030 was killed eventually, but many of the elements of that bill ended up living in other parts of the state legislature's budget. And so most notably, the things that continued to live on from that was that $10 million for the North Dakota Homeless Grant. And well, our recommendation was $200 million, but it would end up being about $25 million for the Housing Incentive Fund, which is less than we wanted, but any investment in housing is critical. So we still consider that to be something that was beneficial. We'd also been tracking some other funds that are related to housing and homelessness, especially kind of what we consider to be housing stability, which includes things like eviction prevention, housing instability, just like funding, helping people stay in their homes. And that initially had been about $13.5 million that was in the Department of Health and Human Services budget, which we did ultimately see get rehomed into the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency. But unfortunately, throughout the legislative session, that $13.5 million also went away. So where we landed at the very end of session was in the Industrial Commission budget bill. North Dakota Housing Finance Agency did get allocated that $10 million for the North Dakota Homeless Grant, and I think that $25 million for the Housing Incentive Fund. And so that's where we landed at the very end of session, and that did pass.
Okay. Well, thank you for that really great overview. I know
Yeah.
there was, going into session, you guys put a lot of work into that, very thoughtful of the buckets of the areas in which we really need to focus on in North Dakota. From my perspective, it is disappointing to not see a bigger investment in some of those needs. As you said, we know that housing is what ends homelessness. And so we'd like to see that continued in that push. But what would you say, is there anything when people are out here in North Dakota wanting to know what they can do or where they can help? What is it that you would recommend for people?
Yeah, I think folks who are local to the Fargo-Moorhead area, the coalition puts out a newsletter a couple times a month. And so that's a really great way to stay plugged in to kind of what's going on, what we're seeing boots on the ground, and any opportunities for advocacy. So just staying plugged in to kind of the experts in the field who are doing the work every day, and just being knowledgeable about kind of what we're facing is really critical. Also, if folks are interested in kind of getting more engaged, we do welcome participation in the coalition. People can become individual members for $30. And so that's a really great way to be engaged. And then we just have a variety of different partners across the state who do really incredible work. A couple of our other regions have their own homeless coalitions, Bismarck, Grand Forks, Minot. And so depending on kind of where you're located across the state, try to find out if there's a group that's already meeting and how you can support those kind of unique needs that our different communities are facing. Those are some of the really great ways to stay involved in just like the greater work of housing and homelessness across the state.
Thanks, Chandler. And I guess one of the things that people are probably curious about, and I don't know if you can share anything, but we do know, like, after the legislature adjourned, that the governor did have a line item veto within some housing. Well, he wanted to eliminate a very specific line item from the housing budget and inadvertently eliminated an entire section. Is there anything that you can share with us about how that is impacting the work that you all do, and potentially what you think might happen as next steps?
Yeah, so this is something that we are really concerned about, and just a huge miss by the administration to have this unfold this way. So what had happened is that the Housing Incentive Fund, those dollars that were housed in the North Dakota Housing Finance Agency, there was a $150,000 carve out for a Native American liaison position. As we know, Native Americans experience homelessness at a much higher rate than the general population, and so we absolutely understand the need for that. The governor's rationale for wanting to line item veto that specific thing was that it would have been one-time funding for a position that maybe wouldn't get funded again. I mean, we can understand that rationale, but what happened was, yes, the entire section, then Section 7, all of the $10 million for the North Dakota Homeless Grant, the $25 million for the Housing Incentive Fund, and that $150,000 carve out were vetoed. And so this is something we're paying a lot of attention to. We've been in contact with our legislators, and basically what we understand right now is there are two different paths forward, and we just aren't sure kind of how that is actually going to play out at this point. So we know that the legislature did bank a couple of extra days so that they could reconvene for other things, just if needed, now that session had ended. So the legislature could call themselves back in order to try to overturn the governor's veto of this specific section of the bill. And then the other alternative is that the governor would have to call a special session. And we do know that that costs taxpayers taxpayers' dollars and all of these things that cause a lot of concern. But if we aren't able to reinstate these dollars, it will be absolutely devastating to the state of North Dakota, to the folks in our communities who are at risk of or currently experiencing homelessness, and the agencies that support them. The North Dakota Homeless Grant provides support for things like emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, prevention efforts, some of the most critical interventions that we have access to at the state level. And if these dollars were not to be reinstated, programs would close across the state, shelters would close, shelters that are planned, programs that are planned would not be able to be implemented. And so we would absolutely see an increase in homelessness because of that. Not to mention, if we do not reinstate that $25 million for the Housing Incentive Fund, that would pretty much halt all affordable housing development across the state. Developers and their nonprofit partners who provide supportive services and champion these projects cannot get these projects over the finish line without these additional state dollars to close those gaps. And with the uncertainty at the federal level about what type of resources we'll be receiving in this arena at all, that combination of factors is something we're really worried about. And so if other folks are wanting to get involved, please reach out to your legislators and let them know how critical it is to reinstate this funding. Otherwise, we're currently in a crisis, but this would be kind of apocalyptic levels of crisis for the housing and homelessness related field. And we would feel those impacts in every part of our state.
Gosh. Thank you for raising that alarm. I think a lot of people are very concerned about the situation, and it seems like we're all a little bit on hold to see when someone's gonna be able to figure out what the next steps are. But as my understanding, that is quite swiftly that the impacts could start hitting communities if we don't come to a resolution very quickly.
Yeah, in fact, the applications for the North Dakota Homeless Grant funding, processes keep moving, even if we're not entirely certain where the dollars will come from. Those were already due. And so agencies have already applied for this funding. It's something that a lot of them are counting on in their future budgets in order to serve more people. That was the point of this, was that we would be able to serve more people, get more people housed, keep them housed, all those different things. And so if we aren't able to see those dollars come back, it's not going to be good for our communities and for those most vulnerable among us.
Well, Chandler, thank you for taking the time to be with us today, but also thank you for your work. I know that it is, really takes a lot of effort and a lot of passion and a lot of heart to do this work. And on the ups and downs that happen during legislative session are both hard on the communities in which you serve and on yourself. So thank you for your dedication to that too.
Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate that. I know all of the different folks who make up this work and this movement appreciate those kind words too. So if you know somebody in your life, I'm talking to all of you out there, you know somebody in your life who is doing this hard work, please don't forget to thank them. We really are trying our best every single day to make sure that we have in place the things we need across all of our communities to prevent homelessness, make it rare, brief, and one time when it does happen, and ensure that everybody has the resources they need to thrive. So we're really grateful for this opportunity with Amplify North Dakota and all of the work that touches housing and homelessness and keeps people stable.
Thank you. Well, welcome, Cody. Thank you for joining us on this legislative recap of Amplify North Dakota. It's so good to have you here. I know you've visited us before, but I'm wondering if you could just remind folks of who you are and the organization that you're with.
Yes, I'm with the ACLU of North Dakota, and I am the advocacy manager for our advocacy work and portfolio here in the state.
Well, thank you for doing such great work here in North Dakota. It's greatly appreciated by myself and many others. So thank you for doing that. And the question that we're kind of leading off with all of our panelists today is just asking you about the 2025 legislative session, going into it, what did you think you'd be facing?
Well, one of the things doing this work is that you never know when you go into the legislative session what is going to actually happen. You can, you go in every time with I think this is what I hear, et cetera. But then until those bills start rolling out, you don't know, what are you supporting? What are you opposing? Unless you have worked with the legislator ahead of time to support some legislation that is coming, it kind of just becomes like a trip to Vegas. It's just a crapshoot, right? As to which direction it's going to take. So this session just became really interesting because, I knew that we would be revisiting some things from the last legislative session. I just didn't know to what extent or how where some of it would go or how anything new like companion bills, right, that would come along that we didn't expect. And so what we did see was just basically some First Amendment issues, religious liberty issues, again, some LGBTQ plus issues. And then one of the things that was interesting for us here at the ACLU this year is that we were actually a part of legislation that after working this past year on tenants' rights and eviction prevention with a lot of our service providers around the state in the world of housing and homelessness, that we went in knowing that there were going to be 3 or 4 bills that we were going to be supporting. And so then, we had that piece. And so, I can recap that to say that only one of them passed. And so, we now, when this state, it'll be a little easier for folks to get their evictions sealed if they have had an eviction on their record. It provides a more clear pathway. But otherwise, we're probably going to revisit those the next legislative session to see if what we learned this session can be applied to improve those bills and partnerships.
Well, it's good always to hear when organizations like yours have the ability to be involved in some proactive legislation, even though your whole package didn't pass. Every little step is helpful in that direction. So thank you for doing that. And I think that kind of brings our conversation a little bit to your defensive work. You talked that a lot of your work revolved around First Amendment rights. So do you want to share with the group what that looked like this session?
Yeah. So really, it did focus on the First Amendment, religious liberty and free speech. And so, first of all, we had library censorship come up again. And knowing that you've had Mariah to talk about those, I won't go into that. But just really so happy to have the governor veto that bill. And so really felt like we made some headway there, and maybe we'll have to have that conversation less again in the future, but I'm not going to bet on it. But aside from that, we really then got into other First Amendment issues that really were about more religious liberty. There was a bill to mandate the resuscitation of the Pledge of Allegiance in classrooms. And we worked on that to just, there already is legislation that should be allowing, or laws that allow that at the local level for school boards to make policies. And so luckily, the conversation went in a different direction. And so we ended up with a bill that didn't mandate. We actually shifted our opposition to a neutral setting because it ended up being mandating to our local school boards that they have a policy and that make sure they're offering an opportunity for students, but took out the pieces that really would have infringed on First Amendment rights of students in that area. And so that we counted that as a victory, even though the bill did pass. It was amended as such that it was much more palatable and much more workable. But then, we had a 10 Commandments bill that would have mandated 10 Commandments being displayed in our schools. School chaplains that would have been paid for by tax dollars, and then putting creationism into our science curriculum. And we're really happy that all 3 of those, that we were able to defeat all 3 of those. It provided interesting conversation and context to see, how legislators worked through those issues, because they were a part of the culture war, but they were so nuanced in ways in that people were still able to speak about their own religious convictions and not vote for them, unlike a lot of other culture war bills that we've seen in the past. And so just really happy to know that taxpayer dollars are not going to be paying for chaplains. It's something that when schools want to bring in local clergy, they already can do that. We don't need to be, having the government basically endorse religion by paying for chaplains. The same thing with taking creationism, or making sure that creationism is in our science curriculum. It's not a scientific theory. As hard as they want to make it into one, it's underlined with religion in such a way that it just doesn't belong in our schools in that way. And then the 10 Commandments, we have that already on law. Schools are free to do that already, to put up 10 Commandments along with other historical documents. But this would have gone so much further to not only mandate it, but actually mandate a particular version of the 10 Commandments. And so it really just was government sanctioned religion, and didn't need to be there. And so luckily, our legislators erred on the side of protecting religious liberty and First Amendment rights. And that's where we ended with those.
That's actually a really tremendous list. So bravo. I think that's impressive to see the defeat of such aggressive legislation, to be honest. And but the one thing that does get frustrating from folks like myself, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers, is this attempt seems to be kind of a time suck and a waste of money, actually, taxpayer dollars, to continually debate something that has been settled for a long time or has already have solutions in place. So it's good, while we kept that from taxpayer dollars going to paying for school chaplains, we still had quite a bit of taxpayer dollars funding this debate of some pretty far, extreme legislation. So thank you for using all your time and your resources to fight back and be successful. And that's very, very impressive.
That's why we're here. And you're exactly right. It is a time suck, and it is, and it is why it's so important to remember the legislation that we pass can be incremental. Again, we've had this debate around 10 Commandments in schools several sessions ago, landing with a permissive policy that gave local control, and was outlined in such a way. And ACLU at that time, we opposed that because it wasn't necessary in the first place, but what we ended up with was palatable, but it was an increment towards where we were today. And so whenever we see some of these bills come, that's why we talk about slippery slopes and what means next after this, because even when we amend them to be more palatable, where they land might be the stepping point for further infringement on our constitutional rights in the future, or attempts, I should say.
Right. And speaking of local control and the misuse of taxpayer dollars, I think that does kind of lead us to the next debate that I think you worked quite handily in, which is when we talked about bills that impacted the LGBTQ and trans communities. Are there things that you'd like to share with our group today about those bills?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say, we did have one victory, and that was decriminalizing HIV status in the state of North Dakota and joining the other states that are doing that. And that bill's been up many times before, and it's never gotten out of committee, so to speak. And this time, we got not only a resounding, healthy passage by both chambers, but we got to have a governor, a signing ceremony with the governor, which is the first time I've ever gotten to do that because I never get to work on that kind of legislation where we're winning. So I have to highlight that. So, we did have that perk. But then on the other side, we had to revisit restrooms and gender identity again. And I think what was so frustrating about that was, first of all, with gender identity, we already have in the last legislative session, our legislators and Governor Burgum erased trans and non-binary people from law and intersex people from law. And so they don't exist in the state of North Dakota when it comes to our North Dakota Century Code. And so to add insult to injury, we had to revisit it again with a bill that really the intention was, in some ways, it didn't do anything new because it just was using language that already was there or just reinforcing what had already been done last time. But then went a step further to really dictate data collection, fields on forms for our state government agencies. And luckily, we were able, and some of our legislators who worked so hard on this, I'm so happy that they were able to say, this is legislative overreach. The legislature doesn't decide what our university systems put on forms. These are not things, when social services in the state, we're not designing the forms at the legislative level. That is executive administrative rule that takes place in a different place. And so essentially this bill that was multiple sections really was just down to one line that reemphasized what they already did last time. And, but at the same time, we have legislators again on the record that they just seem to have this obsession or whatever it is with a lot of our current elected leaders. They just have this contempt for the LGBTQ plus community, for LGBTQ plus citizens who are residents, citizens, and taxpayers of the state, and yet they just continue to attack them in whatever way they can. And so, we'll see what they try to do next time. But I'm growing really tired of that argument because you cannot legislate away the existence of the queer community in North Dakota. And so hopefully this was the last that we have to see for a while, but I'm not going to bet on it because they also then legislated around enforcing really laws that were put in place last time around restroom use in schools and pronoun use in schools. And because that bill last session in 2023 didn't really have a lot of teeth in it or enforcement, they really went to go do that this time. But they also added this design element about legislating how bathrooms could be designed. And so very frustratingly, most of the debate was sucked up in this piece of it and really divided a lot of our advocates' energy and capacity in such a way that basically you were fighting multiple fronts, right? And so it was hard to get some of our folks advocating on the school side to help with the enforcement side, right? Because they were worried about the money that it was going to cost if we were now legislating how we design bathrooms in schools. And so it was really messy and it was really hard. And actually, we were hoping they would hold extra hearings because it was like there were, 3 different issues at hand. But what we ended up with was our Attorney General's office is now boldly empowered to be a bathroom monitor and to, if complaints arise to that level, to go investigate where people are urinating. And it seems to be an incredible waste of our government's time as well. And they did this again under the idea of keeping children safe. And when they do that, it's hard to argue against, but also it is the job of local school boards and local educators to keep kids safe. They know their students, they know their buildings. Legislators don't, and legislators need to stick to their level and the work that is very important in the state. Funding things properly and not infringing on our rights and not telling local schools what they need to be doing.
not only that local control, but saying it's to protect children is actually a fallacy when the truth of the matter is modern bathroom designs are put that way and designed that way to have better oversight of students, to prevent bullying and to provide safer environments. So they just, again, to kind of just ignore the research, the reasoning, and the recommendations and just plow
You're exactly
forward.
right, Amy. There was so much pearl clutching. I've never spent so much time listening. I mean, it was like listening to a conversation in the 18th century, and have legislators try to talk about what, sort of their assumptions about what's happening in restrooms, and to talk about almost like that the virtue and the character of our children is going to be hurt if they're washing hands next to someone of a different gender. I mean, it went so far beyond some of the kind of anti-trans conversations that we had in the last legislative session around this very same law, and went down to these nuts and bolts where we were talking about sinks and where we're washing our hands. And even to hear legislators give their own personal examples of their almost that they were scandalized if they would have to wash their hands after using the restroom next to a colleague who was not of the same gender identity as them. And it was just so strange to see on display our thoughts and the lives of our legislators that seem a little bit disconnected from reality and the lives of what's going on. And again, that these legislators are taking this kind of initiative and telling schools what to do when it just really seems like I'm not even sure if we're living in the same year with them.
Yeah. Well, they're trying their tried and true tactics that are part of segregation, alarmism, hate, and just carrying it forward in different forms. It's incredibly disappointing.
Indeed.
So thank you for working on that bill. And also, before we close, as we're running kind of long, I just wanted to ask, a lot of folks who are watching are huge supporters of the ACLU. What can they be doing now to keep supporting the work that you're doing here in North Dakota?
Well, first of all, always go to our website, aclund.org. You can sign up at the top for updates, and we promise we don't spam you, and we respect your privacy a great deal. So please sign up to get updates if you don't already. But then also, while you're at the website, familiarize yourself with a lot of the resources that we have. We have a lot of Know Your Rights resources. We're going to be updating those things, especially after this legislative session. And so there's going to be lots of resources there. Familiarize yourself with what we have available, what our issue areas are, and then follow us on our socials, because that's really where ACLU North Dakota and where we also share from ACLU National what's going on in our state and what's going on in the country, of things that you might be interested in or want to get involved in advocating for. And so follow those socials. And then this summer, there's a Pride happening in a couple weeks here in Bismarck, and also later in the summer here in Fargo-Moorhead. I'll be tabling at both. So if you're out at those celebrations, stop by and say hello. And of course, through aclund.org, you can also reach out to me directly.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for being with us, Cody, and you have a good rest of your day. All right. Well, welcome, Erin. Thank you for joining us today at Amplify North Dakota. We're excited to have you on the panel. I'm wondering if you could just give everybody listening a brief introduction of yourself and the organization that you're representing today.
Sure. So I'm Erin Oban. I started as a classroom teacher professionally, and kind of got veered into politics in 2014 and 2018, was elected to the North Dakota Senate, serving District 35 in Central Bismarck. And following that service in the Senate, was given the opportunity to serve as a presidential appointee as the state director of USDA Rural Development through the Biden administration. And upon the conclusion of that time, when this last legislative session was happening, and a lot of the discussions were still highly of interest to me as a former legislator and as a former educator, and now frankly, as a mom of a kid in school. And the debates that were happening in the legislature. And one of those debates was about, for the first time, North Dakota giving directly dollars that would support private school tuition. And I think noticed that there was kind of there's no association for just general people who care about an issue like that. And so I helped with a number of folks form a grassroots coalition of just regular North Dakotans, parents, business owners, just people who are community minded or really recognize the value of public education. And we formed a coalition called North Dakotans for Public Schools. So that's who I'm here representing in this conversation today. We worked really hard to oppose vouchers or education savings accounts, some of those dubbed school choice bills during the legislative session. And equally importantly, just to show how much North Dakotans really do value and respect the work of public schools and of public education.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting to have the organization doing that important work. The voices of the people are sometimes, people really want information and aren't always sure where they can plug in. So it's really great to have North Dakotans for public schools for just us citizens and parents to plug into. So
Yeah.
that's right. Now, speaking of vouchers and legislative session, this is our legislative recap event. So why don't you share a little bit with us about and remind everybody the big bills that you were I'm assuming most of your work was defensive, but if you had proactive bills too, you want to walk us through a little bit about what your docket looked like?
Sure. So primarily we kind of organized around, as I mentioned, those voucher or education savings accounts bills that were introduced during the 2025 legislative session. There were up to 7 bills that were kind of dubbed as school choice bills, but really primarily 2 of them rose to the gaining the most traction in the legislative session. One was a Senate bill, one was a House bill. Ultimately, they would do the same thing. In theory, they would take public taxpayer dollars, put it into an account that parents could access to support students who would attend private schools. And fundamentally, we just disagree with the use of public dollars supporting private school education that is not accountable to taxpayers, that does not require acceptance of all students. And so each of those bills, one passed the Senate, moved to the House. That was Senate Bill 2400. One passed the House, over to the Senate, and also passed the Senate. That was House Bill 1540. And House Bill 1540 went to the governor's desk for signature and ultimately was vetoed by Governor Armstrong. And we believe that part of the reason for that is because there was such public engagement in that. And it shows the importance of people engaging in the process, and that really their voices mattered tremendously in that outcome. But we know that likely the issue will not go away. So.
Speaking of voices, speaking out, I know that you had some pretty compelling people testifying in oppositions to this bill. Like, could you share with the group a little bit of what people's main concerns were when they were up there and speaking out?
Yeah, we did have just a really representative, I think, mix of perspectives that came forward in opposition to those bills. Some of them were, of course, public educators, whether they were rural school administrators who really talked about what it's like being in a rural space, leading a school where public schools are the pillars, the cornerstones of rural communities, what it's like being an employer, what it's like trying to make sure that you have the services needed to serve all your students, and what would happen if dollars were siphoned away for any reason, really, that would take those dollars away from supporting public schools. We also heard from parents, and one of them was a parent of a child with disabilities, where she talked about what it was like trying to get her child to be able to stay at first in private preschools, because we don't have public preschools in North Dakota, and how many different preschools her little kiddo got kicked out of because she had challenges that were not being served, and when you are in a private environment, you can just kick that kid out, and what that felt like to her as a mom, and the incredible services and supports and teachers that surrounded her when she got into the public schools, and now how thriving her child is doing. We heard from other advocates for students with disabilities, making sure that voice was not lost in this discussion and decision. And we heard from economic development, talking about really, like, when people look to move into a community, almost the first thing they look for is how good is the school system. And when you recognize like that piece, which oftentimes gets forgotten in education discussions, was a really, really interesting perspective to be included.
Yeah, I think you guys did a phenomenal job, like from the outside here, like seeing what was happening. I mean, our organization participated in some of that, but to see people raising their voices up and talking about really like the impact on our rural communities, our North Dakota way of life, really, when our public schools are already struggling, and to take even more resources, and knowing that so many counties don't even have an institution that would have their student, like it wasn't an option to participate, really, right? So,
and then an interesting, because sometimes, you know, strange bedfellows, right? We talk about that all the time. There was pretty strong opposition from the homeschool community, who really stepped forward and said, first of all, the public schools are really good partners with us as homeschooling parents to be able to provide some coursework, some activities, extracurriculars for our children to engage in. But they also kept saying, we've seen what happens in other states that do this. And when we start taking public dollars to support a private decision we're making, what comes next are the strings attached. And they don't want them. Like, this is why they made the decision to homeschool. And, you know, North Dakotans for Public Schools respects families' decisions, whatever they might be, whether it's to enroll their kids in a parochial school, to homeschool their children. We respect that decision. We just don't think it's up to the taxpayers to pay for it.
And such a wide variety of people
Really,
and organizations
yeah.
opposed, really, I think, is so pointed in what a bad piece of legislation is when you have all those different kinds of people stepping up. So Erin, tell me, so you mentioned, you know, so where we ended the legislative session was with the defeat of one of the bad voucher bills, the veto of the other. So what do you think is on the horizon, or what are the next steps for your organization, or, you know, share with us a little bit more about what that
Yeah, you know, and I also just want to, because all of these things are connected. Like when the legislature is making a decision on where they are going to put limited resources on what they fund, this was all in the midst of a big property tax debate on how are we going to provide property tax relief. At the same time, there are massive federal cuts being made and proposed. So is the state going to pick up the tab for some pretty significant, especially human services that might be lost? And all of those things end up filtering and you know, applying to what happens with funding for public schools as well. So like that, all of those factors were, I really think, at play, and should continue to be considered in what does come next with regard to this discussion, and certainly where we will be as a coalition of North Dakotans for Public Schools. Right now, we are really trying to figure out how can we be of most benefit in continuing to connect parent perspective, community perspective with our public schools. When there's really broad support for our public schools, we want to make sure that that support is being shown to our elected officials, certainly to our legislators, to legislative candidates. I think oftentimes people will say, of course I support education, but we need to know what does that mean? What does that mean when you say that? And then how can we continue to make sure that our public schools feel supported, and also continue to include the voices and the role of parents and communities in the work that they're doing.
I agree.
You know, we are also going to explore what we do with the momentum we built with a coalition that grew very quickly, very fast around an issue that is clearly of importance to North Dakotans, and what we can do about that in a way that can make a positive difference to this discussion.
That sounds very smart. Erin, before we close up this conversation, what about the people who are watching and they want to do more? What can they do to continue to support your work or the work of the organization?
Sure. So, you know, as we continue to really figure out what we should do with this groundswell of people who joined North Dakotans for Public Schools, you can go to our website. And if you have not yet signed up, we've been a little quiet since the legislative session, but we want to continue to build up our coalition. So I would encourage you to go to www.ndforpublicschools.com, and there's a sign up. You just have to enter your name, your email address, and your zip code. We of course want to know where you're from. You can follow us on Facebook, ND for Public Schools there. And so we can just stay in touch with you as we really determine how can we all use our voices most effectively together, because that's what I really think that's what we learned, is that when we all recognize we can't rely on other people to do this, we have to be the ones who are making clear to our elected officials where we stand on issues that are really important to us. We will continue to identify ways that we can do that proactively, preferably than reactively.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think that's a really good note to end on, is that it's those personal stories. So anybody who, has any, concern about public schools, whether they have a student in the schools or they're a member of the community concerned about their schools, or
Or an
those,
employer.
or right, an employer,
All
an
of our
employee.
employers rely on
Yes. Oh, yes.
well-educated, prepared kids coming out of our school system. Like that's one of the biggest, I think, things we sometimes forget is our workforce relies on the kids that we are raising, and the way that we support them. When 94% I think of our students are educated in our public school system, we need to make sure that we have the strongest, best public schools so that we can raise and educate the best kids and continue to support really great communities in North Dakota.
Right. Just making a better North Dakota.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for all the work that you've been organizing at the legislature and helping funnel people to tell their stories to fight back against these voucher bills. And we look forward to working with you down the road, as I know there'll be more things on the horizon.
Well, thanks again for the recap, Amy. Looking forward to listening to your other panelists. And thanks again for everybody who joined us. And if you haven't, it's not too late.
Thank you very much. Well, Christina, welcome. Thank you for joining us for Amplify North Dakota for our 2025 legislative recap. We're really excited to have you here today and to hear a little bit about the work that you helped to, that you worked on during the legislative session. So could you first start by introducing yourself to everybody here today?
For sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Christina Sambor. I'm a licensed attorney in North Dakota. I, over my career, have kind of bounced back and forth between kind of typical private practice and then kind of coalition and nonprofit work. And so what that's looked like for me over time is going back about 10 years, starting to work on anti-trafficking, runaway or unhoused services, moving kind of more into human rights work and gender equity work. And so that's kind of like, so since 2015, I've been involved in lobbying at the North Dakota legislature on those different issues. Outside of that, have kind of developed a legal career in family law and doing some kind of small business and employee side employment law, and then also civil rights and gender equity work. So I'm currently counsel of record on both the abortion lawsuit, which is under consideration by the North Dakota Supreme Court, and then also on the gender affirming care lawsuit, which we're awaiting a ruling from the court. So that's kind of just a quick. I'm also a mom of a toddler and 2 corgis, and I live out in Bismarck. So.
Well, that is a really impressive background. I wanted to first thank you for doing that work in North Dakota, because I know how difficult the landscape is here, especially in sort of those very specific issue areas. And actually, that leads us to a bit of this conversation today. Wanted to hear from you when we headed into the 2025 legislative session. What were you preparing for? What did you think would be on the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I think always one of the tensions in going into the legislative session in North Dakota is it can be really easy to just be pulled into defensive work, because the supermajority, the representation in the North Dakota State Legislature breaks out about 85-15, I think, if I'm doing the math right, in terms of, Republican or conservative members of the body, and then progressive or Democratic or liberal members of the body. And so those folks tend to come in with a big, horrifying agenda. And so there's just a lot of work to be done, countering narratives, trying to beat back legislation. At the same time, I think for many years, we've been engaged in conversations about how we can work to, identify some proactive areas where we can try to maybe have more narrative control and show people that there are, people that are elected to office that don't subscribe to a lot of those kind of overwhelmingly oppressive policies. And so every time we go in, we're just ready to you kind of got to wait and see what's coming as the bills get filed. And then it's just a lot of demand on like a defensive agenda. So it's kind of finding bills to defeat and then hoping for some pleasant surprises. So.
And it seems like this legislative session was a little bit different on the proactive end of stuff when it comes to reproductive health. Generally, our time is really consumed by, and was the session too, by defeating some bad things. But Representative Carla Rose Hansen brought a couple of really important bills forward around protecting IVF and protecting birth control. I wonder if you could share with folks a little bit about the arc of the story of those bills.
Yeah. it was great to see Representative Rothanson bring those forward. It was actually something that I had been talking about with the organization I was working for at the time, and we were kind of talking about what are some things we could be doing to bring proactive bills. One of the big achievements over the last couple of years has been winning the lawsuit against the existing abortion law that I've been working on, like I said, for 2 years now. And so, that kind of in the background is helpful to know that we're, some of the big differences between the legislature and the court system is, the legislature, people get elected and they vote how they want to vote. And there isn't some evidentiary requirement, right, to show that policies are likely to be helpful, that policies are based in fact and truth. And so sometimes it's nice to be able to pull then what we know are ill-informed laws into the court system to say, okay, now show some evidence that this is actually good policy. And we know they can't. So I think, kind of moving forward in bringing a message that says, well, if you care so much about your quote unquote pro-life position, then why don't we make sure that people's access to contraception and access to assisted reproductive technologies like IVF and like IUIs are protected? Because if the goal here is really to prevent abortion, so to say, and that's what they claim, then there's no reason not to support access to contraception and support, protecting people's right to use medical technology to have families. And so Representative Rose Hansen brought those forward. And unfortunately, what we feared and predicted was true, is that there's no appetite to actually take those stances and protect those rights. So, I think it's important for people to understand that when you see those types of just kind of like obvious pieces of policy that are widely popular, that would be helpful to a lot of people, are voted down, it's because there's more to the pro-life agenda, right, than just their purported statements of being anti-abortion. There's a lot of conflation with, I think, extreme religious beliefs about the propriety of contraception. There's a lot of societal beliefs about the role of women and whether or not we should have control over whether or not we become pregnant. And so I was really glad to see the bills come forward. I think there's important conversation. It's really important to create opportunities to point out these maybe underlying themes to what people think of as just kind of the abortion fight, so that people are clear about what, the people they have elected to office are doing and what they care about.
I think that's a really, really wise, wise way of thinking about it. While from the outside perspective, not even outside, we worked on, we helped to support these bills too. One of the things that I think is really compelling, you said, you mentioned there's no appetite for these things, and we need to be like really specific that we meant by legislators, because the appetite by the general public was overwhelming. And
Absolutely.
Just reminding our people who are watching today is that like hundreds of people reached out to their legislators. Probably 100 people shared their actual stories of IVF and birth control needs and all of the things that go around that sort of reproductive health care that allows people to build and plan their families and have really, healthy, strong families in North Dakota. And they turned a deaf ear to that. And I think you're exactly right in pointing out and tying for people that this is the exact draws an exact line to the attacks on abortion rights. The abortion rights are not just around access to abortion, but much more broader agenda that includes, not having access to birth control, not having access to IVF. And additionally, like you referenced too, is some really horrifying statements by some of our legislators on the floor, on public record, about women and people who use IVF services. So one of those things we want to remember as we move forward, right, through the rest of this year and into the next session, is that they're not friendly to women. They're not friendly to reproductive rights, and they certainly have an agenda that's no longer hidden.
Well, I think one of the things too that people should keep in mind is that it's easy to blow off like really extreme statements when they come from Lori Van Winkle, right? Because it's like, she's somebody who I had to kind of laugh as the session went along. She increasingly was like, I know nobody wants to hear from me, but, so even within her own party, there were tensions, and she realized, the stances she was taking on things that I think both have watched hearings where other conservative lawmakers really went after her because of how flippant, right? And just disrespectful she was in the presentation of her information. And so, the thing you're referring to that's, I think, but that sticks out to me was, essentially arguing that, a 12-year-old who gets pregnant and has an abortion should be considered a murderer. I mean, just these really outrageous and perhaps if you want to get pregnant, you should look at the sin in your life and maybe God will remove the curse from your womb. Yeah. It's not even worth going down the litany of ways you can attack the credibility of those statements because they're obnoxious. But I think what's important to understand is whether it's a true belief in the things she believes in or whether it's a cowardice to take a position different than what the party requires. I think a lot of people that have a voting majority in our state on some level agree with those types of sentiments. They don't have sympathy for the realities of pregnancy complications. They don't have empathy for people who are experiencing infertility. You hear 1 in 8. I'm like, from my experience, I think it's like 1 in 4. I mean, so many of my friends in the state, I don't know if it's like agricultural chemicals or what, but I feel like I know so many people that have struggled with infertility. And I just want to say that, at the end of the day, like, we have the government we elect, and you have to look at the fact that these people, as much as you can kind of blame a few extreme legislators, the rest of the body is also voting in line with that and are not protecting, reproductive rights, broadly defined. And we have to decide whether or not we care enough about that to do something about it.
Yeah,
You're
exactly right. And another thing that your conversations are reminding me of, kind of when we talked a little bit about kind of the flippancy of which the legislators can deal with these issues, it also sparked with me this other action that happened during the legislative session, which is when Senator Jana Myrdal was very flippant about the processes that bills need to go through in order to be voted on. And what we deemed the Myrdal amendment, where she came in at the last minute with $1 million budget request that went through no committee hearings, which the conversation in those when she brought that forward was really about providing state-funded money for a political campaign. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit with those viewers about the Myrdal Amendment and what happened there, because I know hundreds of people did reach out, and it was a very last-minute sort of effort. But maybe we should define a little bit more for people about what happened there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, at the outset, I want to say, like, one of the things that's like, sort of cynically funny about it is that had she done it the right way, she probably could have marshaled the votes to do what she wanted to do here. And what she wanted to do was create a life committee with state funding that would essentially, I think, do a few things. From what I understood, the purpose of it was there was also a bill that requires now OBGYNs or doctors providing abortions to watch an educational video on the state's abortion laws. And it's really kind of an attempt to thumb the legislature's nose at the Supreme Court, kind of at least initially upholding the district court's position to strike down the abortion law, right? Without getting too much in the weeds. But, part of this life committee, I think, was intended to exercise control over that process and who was going to make that video and make that education. And then also to basically develop a statewide campaign because they anticipate the need for a ballot measure to that they're going to win the lawsuit, the state will win the lawsuit, and then that proponents for reproductive freedom would have to bring a ballot measure forward. So this whole exercise was an effort to create this committee to funnel taxpayer money into what's essentially a political campaign, which, number one, is not something they can do. You cannot allocate state funds for political purposes. But on top of that, the legislative session starts in January and goes all the way through the end of April. And that's because there's 2 sets of review of bills, right? So it starts on one side and there's a committee hearing. And then if it appropriates money, it goes to appropriations. If it passes and then it goes to the whole body, like on the House side, for example, that all passes and it goes over to the Senate and goes through that whole process again. So there's like multiple committee hearings along the way. And that's when people get to show up and testify and talk about, their feelings on things, whether or not this is good policy, et cetera. Jana Myrdal basically leapfrogged all of that. And at the very last minute, without even any hearings, tried to add an amendment, right? So when you're thinking about, 1 to 100 in terms of like sort of the path to the finish line at like 95, she showed up with this amendment. And, interestingly enough, it failed by 1 vote. And the objections were really around procedure, that this is not how we do things. We do not sneak things in, appropriate money at the last minute, deny people the right to show up at hearings, deny people the right to understand policy. And so, yeah, it was a fun win, to see that go down. And I think it was an important one too, that procedure does matter, because there's really significant ways in which people's participation in their government can be sidelined by these types of antics where it's kind of closed door backroom deals. And so so really that to me was like one of the best like wins and moment of the legislature was that of the legislative session this time was that particular effort was thwarted.
Yeah, I agree. And it was really cool to see how swiftly advocates out here in the community did take the call to action and contact their legislators and just say, this is wrong. I mean, wrong on principle, wrong on likely illegal as far as allocating state dollars, and also wrong for the process in which it was done. And I think it exposes even more the anti-choice legislators' power that they are trying to wield at the legislature and like doing these pretty corrupt practices, which is par for the course when it comes to some of these folks. But also just how wonderful it is to see, you know, people like being able to put that down and put it to rest and say that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think taking a look at stuff like that and knowing like showing up and continuing to fight in places like North Dakota matters, right? Because it's like we can feel like, oh, the numbers are so bad. And like, you know what I mean? Like it just feels like you can't win anything at the legislature. But then you see things like this and you go, you know what? Like, I mean, for those of us that watched, you know, Dave Clemens was like one of the people that stood up on the floor and really railed about procedure. And it's just like, who knew you were going to agree with him on something? So you know, and not to give him too many flowers, but I, you know, those things slide through if people don't stand up and shout and say this is not okay. And it worked. So
well, I think that is a wonderful way to close our conversation today. Just that call to people, remember, like, your voice does matter, and there are ways for you to continue to work on reproductive health and reproductive rights in North Dakota, to reach out to organizations that do that kind of work and individuals, and to just keep paying attention. So thank you for your good work, and thank you for being here with us today.
Well, same to you, Amy. It's like one of the best parts of my job is getting to partner with you and your organization. And so I always appreciate and want everybody listening, because Amy won't tell you herself, to know that Prairie Action does so much of the work to get you the opportunities to engage. And so thank you to Amy and Prairie Action. And it's good to be here.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hey there, everyone. Today I am going to be talking to you about a program that we host here at Prairie Action called North Dakota Megaphone. Now, let me just share my screen with you and I'll tell you all about it. So, North Dakota Megaphone, welcome. First of all, let's just start. My name is Sydney Stock. I am one of 3 team members that make up Prairie Action North Dakota and Prairie Action North Dakota Institute, and I am the digital communications organizer. If you've been to our Amplifies before, you've met me, and I lead the North Dakota Megaphone program. So what is Megaphone? Megaphone is a free app built to help North Dakotans speak up online. It's like a ready-to-go library full of pretty powerful posts, complete with images and captions covering the issues and values that matter the most. Within our Megaphone app, you'll find everything from cool graphics on reproductive rights, immigration, and LGBTQ issues to memes and messages that speak to what North Dakotans care about. And they're all ready to share with captions, and you can share to all of your social medias. So let's take a look at what the Megaphone app actually looks like. This is a little bit of an older video. You'll see the dates on there from 24, but so like I said, it's basically just a library of relevant posts about, you know, issues that matter to North Dakotans, and wide range of topics and things like that. Sometimes there'll be news articles posted in there with a graphic that you're able to share to your social medias to let your family and friends know what's going on in your world. We'll share resources, links that are helpful to people that you might know, or things that you just want to get the word out about or speak up about. So that's really what the app looks like. It's pretty simple, straightforward, and there's a search function which allows you to look up the topics that you care about the most. So why megaphone? The media landscape is changing. We all can probably guess that by now. The reality is that people are going online to get news from friends, family, influencers, rather than reading the newspaper or using cable news. The movement must meet the moment to reach individuals where they actually are. North Dakota Megaphone was created to build a strong community online rooted in not only trust, but accessibility, and creating a space where people can connect, share, and really just speak up together with one unified voice rather than several disjointed voices. Now, let's just take a look at how simple it is to share posts within the Megaphone app. So, say you're interested in homelessness in North Dakota, that is a hot topic always, but especially right now. You're able to scroll through and pick an image that really stands out to you. And we have been using the Megaphone app since October of 2023. So there is a wide variety of graphics that you can share. So you can either screenshot it or you can share it to your story. You could choose which social media. You just copy and paste that caption that's available, or you can tweak it and create your own. Post to your social media, and it's as easy as that. Or you can go directly to Instagram and share it that way. And there it is. Very simple. And it's just as easy to share to Facebook as it is to share to Instagram. And we'll show you how to do that. So we're coming up on summertime. Let's talk about removing barriers to pools and parks. So we got this image here. We're going to copy that message and we're going to scroll to our Facebook app. And we just want to post it to our feed. So the image will come up. We'll click paste. And we can add a hashtag if we want. And there you go. It's posted to your Facebook. So different ways that you can help. Maybe you're not so active on your social media, but you still want to be involved. You can always send us your own content. We would love to be sharing your different graphics and images to the Megaphone app as well. You can also tell your friends and family to go and sign up. And you can also be invited to trainings and events, and those are offered through our North Dakota Megaphone mail system. Speaking of which, there's always a lot happening, and I want to help you guys stay in the loop. So when you sign up for Megaphone, you're also signing up for to receive Megaphone mail, which is a weekly news update with new content, app updates, and fresh posts made just for the North Dakota Megaphone community. So you can also receive different action alerts in that piece of Megaphone mail, various events and news articles, things like that that are most relevant to the community. And Megaphone Media, if you are active on Facebook, you don't really want to receive any more emails, you can stay in the loop by joining the North Dakota Megaphone private Facebook group. So in there, new content is posted, and you're able to connect with other people who are already signed up and participating in the North Dakota Megaphone program. So you can be a digital advocate from your couch. All of this happens on your phone. It's super easy to use. It's all relevant to North Dakotans. There is some federal, like flavor tied into the posts more often now than I guess it used to be. But you can do it all. You can be an advocate from home. You don't have to attend any special volunteer trainings or anything like that. Like it's so easy to do, especially if you are interested in social media. So we would love for you to join the North Dakota Megaphone program. You can scan this QR code right here on the screen. So I'll give you guys just a little bit of time to go ahead and do that. You'll receive an email with us. Well, an email from me that will guide you through like your first steps, how to sign up, how to make an account using the Our Megaphone app, available on Android and iPhone. And then you can also do Our Megaphone on your computer if you're more savvy with your laptop or your desktop or something like that. I sometimes prefer to use the browser myself, but it's also super easy to use on your phone. So, last but not least, if you are already a North Dakota Megaphone user, I'm curious if you've downloaded the app yet. And if you haven't, you can scan here to download if you have an iPhone, and scan here to download if you have an Android. And just regularly check the app to find new content, and then choose your favorite images and messages that appeal to you and copy the post, and it's just as easy as that. And if you've recently signed up and added your phone number, you can expect Megaphone Mail text messages. You won't receive any more than once a week. We're starting to get our text messaging program up and running. So if you've been signed up to receive text messages, you will be receiving those starting soon. So with that, I will stop sharing. Thank you guys so much for your interest and your advocacy. It's really, really, really important. When you're a messenger by yourself in your circle, that could affect up to 10 people. And if one of those people is a messenger in their circle, that's another 10 people that could be listening, you know? So let's utilize the resources that we have and reach people where they are.